They called him King Aurelius Varron, and his reign was remembered not for wars won or lands conquered, but for what lingered behind closed doors. His palace rose in pale stone above the river like a promise of order and prosperity. From a distance, it appeared refined, almost merciful. Inside, however, the air carried a quieter truth, one learned by women long before it was ever spoken aloud. The court functioned with precision. Bells marked the hours. Servants moved without sound. Courtiers smiled when they were expected to smile. Yet beneath that discipline existed a set of customs never written into law, never proclaimed from the throne. They were traditions, older than Aurelius himself, inherited and perfected under his rule. And they belonged almost entirely to the women of the court. Every woman who entered the palace was taught the same lesson in her first days. Survival depended on silence. The king valued harmony, or so he said, and harmony meant obedience to rituals that preserved balance. The men of the court repeated those words as reassurance. The women learned their real meaning through experience. The first tradition revealed itself subtly. It was known as the night of selection, though never spoken aloud. Once each season, the king observed the court from behind a carved screen, unseen. Women were summoned not by name, but by gesture. A ring turned on a finger. A servant's pause. A door left open when it should have been closed. Those chosen were expected to present themselves without question, without delay. Refusal was not punished openly. It was answered with absence, dismissal from favor, from protection, from memory. Aurelius claimed this ritual strengthened loyalty. In truth, it cultivated fear. Women measured their steps, their voices, their very breathing, knowing attention could be as dangerous as neglect. To be noticed was perilous. To be forgotten was worse. What haunted them was not a single night, but the waiting. Days spent wondering if the king's eyes had lingered too long. Nights passed listening for footsteps that might stop at their door. No explanation was ever given. None was required. The tradition endured because it thrived on uncertainty. Older women warned the younger ones in fragments and glances. They never told full stories. Complete truths were too heavy to carry and too dangerous to share. Instead, they passed down rules disguised as advice. Never draw attention, never trust kindness, never believe the ritual ends with one summons. This was only the first custom, the most visible one. There were others, crueler, quieter, more lasting, that shaped the lives of women in Aurelius Varron's court. Together, they formed an invisible architecture of control, one that outlived moments and scarred generations. And within those walls of stone and ceremony, the women learned that tradition, when left unquestioned, could become the most enduring form of cruelty. The second tradition was known among the women as the veil of correction. Officially, it did not exist. In court records, it was described only as a period of reflection granted to those who had disrupted order. In reality, it was a disappearance that carried its own quiet terror. When a woman displeased the king, or embarrassed a powerful man close to him, she was not accused publicly. No charges were announced. One morning, her chambers would be empty, her belongings untouched, as if she might return at any moment. Servants were instructed to continue airing the room, lighting candles, setting fresh linens. The illusion of presence was part of the punishment. Those taken under the veil were confined to the inner wing of the palace, a place without windows and without time. Their days blended into one another, measured only by footsteps and the opening of doors. They were denied mirrors, letters, and names. Guards referred to them by number, reinforcing the lesson the king wished them to learn. Identity was conditional. Aurelius believed correction required isolation. He claimed solitude purified loyalty. But what it truly refined was submission. Women returned altered, quieter, slower to meet the eyes of others. Some never returned at all. Their names faded from conversation, replaced by cautionary silences. The third tradition followed closely, like a shadow attached to the second. It was called inheritance of blame. When a woman fell from favor, responsibility did not end with her. Sisters, daughters, and attendants felt the consequences. Invitations were withdrawn. Promises dissolved. Marriage negotiations collapsed without explanation. This custom ensured obedience spread beyond the individual. Women became guardians of one another's behavior, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. A careless word could doom an entire household. A single misstep could echo across generations. The court praised this system as efficiency. The women understood it as entrapment. Love became dangerous. Friendship became measured. Trust dissolved into strategy. Survival required vigilance not only over oneself, but over everyone nearby. What haunted them most was the unpredictability. No one ever knew which action would trigger the veil, or whose family would suffer next. The king never clarified the rules. Clarity would have limited his power. And so the women learned to live in fragments, half thoughts, half words, half lives, knowing that tradition did not need cruelty to be loud. Sometimes, the most brutal customs were the ones that operated in near silence, leaving nothing behind but absence and fear. The fourth tradition was the one the women feared long before they ever understood it. It was known as the oath of endurance, and it was taught as honor. To the men of the court, it was a test of loyalty. To the women, it was a sentence without an end. Every woman formally bound to palace life, ladies in waiting, widows under royal protection, daughters of allied houses, was required to swear the oath before entering full service. The words were spoken in a ceremonial hall, beneath banners and sacred symbols. They promised obedience, discretion, and gratitude. What the oath truly demanded was endurance without complaint. Under this tradition, suffering could never be named as such. Pain was redefined as duty. Fear was reframed as weakness. If a woman faltered, she was reminded that endurance was proof of worth. If she broke, she was said to lack character. King Aurelius praised this custom more than any other. He claimed it forged strength. In truth, it erased boundaries. Once endurance became a virtue, cruelty no longer required justification. Any hardship imposed could be defended as refinement. Any resistance could be labeled betrayal. The fifth tradition completed the circle. It was called the ceremony of silence, and it followed death. When a woman died within palace walls, whether from illness, despair, or causes never recorded, no mourning was permitted. Curtains remained open. Bells did not toll. Conversations continued as if nothing had changed. Those closest to the deceased were forbidden from acknowledging the loss for 7 days. No prayers spoken aloud. No tears witnessed. Silence was framed as respect, but everyone understood its real purpose. Grief, if shared, could become testimony. Silence ensured nothing followed a woman beyond her final breath. Together, these traditions formed an invisible prison. None were written into law, yet all were enforced with absolute consistency. They haunted the women not because they were sudden, but because they were permanent. Each generation inherited them like a shadow, learning their weight long before understanding their shape. At night, when the palace grew still, women lay awake listening to the echoes of footsteps in distant corridors. They counted seasons, memorized rules that were never spoken, and learned to read the smallest signs of danger. The pause. A glance. A summons delivered too politely. King Aurelius Varron would later be praised by chroniclers as a ruler of stability and refinement. His reign would be described as orderly, disciplined, enlightened for its time. But among the women who survived it, his legacy lived on differently. Not in words, but in instincts. Not in records, but in scars that never faded. Tradition, they learned, did not need to be violent to be cruel. It only needed to be unquestioned. There was another layer to these traditions, one rarely discussed even in whispers. It was not a single ritual, but a pattern woven through daily life, known among the women as the measure of favor. Under King Aurelius Varron, favor was a currency more dangerous than gold, because it could never be seen, counted, or secured. A woman in favor was protected, temporarily. Doors opened for her. Accusations dissolved before forming. Promises were kept. But favor was never permanent, and its withdrawal was always sudden. One morning, a woman might wake surrounded by smiles and deference. By evening, she would feel the shift, servants avoiding her gaze, guards hesitating before answering her questions, allies offering carefully distant sympathy. The cruelty of this tradition lay in its instability. Favor was granted without explanation and revoked without warning. No one ever knew what preserved it. Beauty faded. Youth expired. Obedience alone was never enough. This uncertainty forced women to compete silently, measuring their worth not against principle, but against one another. Friendships fractured under its weight. Kindness became calculated. Every gesture was scrutinized for intention. To help another woman rise was to risk one's own fall. The court did not need to command rivalry. The tradition nurtured it naturally. Older women spoke of a time before Aurelius, when favor followed service and loyalty. Under his rule, it followed whim. This shift was deliberate. A divided court was easier to govern. Women learned that isolation was safer than solidarity. Those who lost favor often found themselves drawn into the earlier traditions, the veil, the oath, the silence, with terrifying speed. The palace had many thresholds, and falling through one often meant tumbling through them all. What haunted the women most was how ordinary this cruelty felt over time. They adapted. They adjusted their expectations downward. Fear became routine. The extraordinary became invisible. King Aurelius rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. His power lived in systems, in habits repeated until they felt natural. Tradition, in his court, was not enforced through force, but through normalization. And so the women endured, not because they believed in these customs, but because resistance had been designed to feel impossible. The greatest cruelty was not what the king demanded, but what the traditions taught them to accept. As years passed, the women began to understand the most dangerous tradition of all was not one ceremony or oath, but the illusion of choice. King Aurelius Varron often spoke of freedom within order. He praised the court as a place where women were protected and honored, insisting that any path they followed had been chosen willingly. In practice, every option led to the same destination. A woman could leave the court, but only by marriage approved by the king. She could refuse service, but only by retreating into religious seclusion, stripped of inheritance and voice. She could remain, advancing carefully through favor and obedience, knowing how quickly both could vanish. Each path carried consequences that made refusal feel irrational, even dangerous. This illusion was carefully maintained. Women were encouraged to believe their survival was proof of agency. If they endured, it meant they were strong. If they suffered, it was framed as the cost of their own decisions. Responsibility was quietly shifted from the system to the individual. Those who broke under the weight of it were spoken of with pity, not outrage. She was too fragile, the court would say. She was not suited for palace life. In this way, cruelty absolved itself. The palace trained women to police their own thoughts. Doubt became a private shame. Anger felt childish. Even fear was treated as a personal failing. Over time, many stopped imagining a life beyond the court at all. The walls ceased to feel like barriers and instead became borders of the only world that mattered. What haunted them was how completely the traditions reshaped identity. Women who arrived with confidence learned caution. Those who once spoke freely learned restraint. Laughter softened. Silence deepened. The court did not need to break them openly, it only needed to outlast them. King Aurelius aged gracefully, surrounded by ritual and respect. His legacy grew in marble and ink. But among the women, his true monument was invisible. A shared understanding passed quietly from one generation to the next. That power, once normalized, does not announce itself as tyranny. It disguises itself as order, as opportunity, as tradition. And by the time it is recognized for what it is, it has already taken root in the minds of those forced to live within it. In the later years of Aurelius Varron's reign, a final tradition emerged, one never named, yet deeply felt. The women came to recognize it as the erasure of memory. It was subtle, almost elegant in its cruelty, and it ensured that no suffering could ever fully survive him. Stories were discouraged, then quietly corrected. When a woman spoke of the past, she was gently reminded that memories were unreliable. Events were reframed as misunderstandings, hardships softened into necessary trials. Scribes altered records with small omissions, careful wording, polished restraint. What could not be erased entirely was reshaped until it lost its sharpness. Younger women arrived at court knowing almost nothing of what had come before. Warnings sounded exaggerated. Fear seemed inherited rather than earned. The absence of clear history made resistance feel unjustified, even ungrateful. How could one rebel against something that had no official proof of harm? Those who remembered too much became uncomfortable presences. They were not punished outright. Instead, they were ignored, spoken over, treated as remnants of another time. Their relevance faded, and with it, their credibility. Memory itself became a liability. This tradition haunted the women because it denied them even the dignity of truth. Pain that could not be named could not be mourned. Injustice that could not be proven could not be challenged. Each generation started again from silence, believing their fear was unique, their endurance personal. Aurelius rarely intervened directly. He trusted the system he had refined. By the time his health failed, the court functioned almost automatically, cruelty sustained not by command, but by habit. The women understood then that the king's greatest power was not what he had done, but what he had taught others to continue. And long after his voice grew weak, the tradition still spoke for him. When the end of King Aurelius Varron finally approached, it did not arrive with revelation or regret. The court prepared as it always had, methodically, quietly, with rehearsed grace. Physicians came and went. Curtains were drawn and redrawn. The women watched from the edges, knowing that a ruler could fade while his traditions remained fully alive. In those final months, something shifted among them. Not rebellion, not courage in the heroic sense, but awareness. They began to recognize the patterns for what they were, structures designed to endure beyond any single man. The cruelty had never relied on Aurelius's strength. It relied on repetition. Women who had once blamed themselves started to see how carefully their choices had been narrowed. They noticed how fear had been shared, taught, inherited. Small acts of quiet resistance appeared, almost invisible. A warning whispered more clearly than before, a memory told in fuller detail, a refusal to correct another woman's grief with silence. These acts did not dismantle the system. They were too small for that. But they cracked something more fragile, belief. Once belief weakened, obedience lost its certainty. When Aurelius died, the court entered mourning with flawless precision. Bells rang. Banners fell. Words of praise filled the halls. The women followed every rule, every posture, every expected tear. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, they understood something crucial. The king's body could be buried, but his traditions would only die if they were remembered honestly. Forgetting had been his greatest ally. Memory, they realized, could become their quiet defiance. They began to pass down stories not as warnings disguised as advice, but as truth. Not loudly, not publicly, but with intention. Names were spoken. Causes were remembered. Silences were named for what they were. The palace still stood. The customs still lingered. But something irreversible had begun. Once cruelty is seen clearly, it loses its disguise. Tradition no longer appears sacred when its purpose is exposed. And for the first time, the women understood that haunting did not come only from what had been done to them, but from what would continue if no one dared to remember. After Aurelius Varron's death, the court spoke of renewal. New banners were raised. New vows were sworn. A different name sat upon the throne. To outsiders, it appeared that an era had ended. For the women, the truth was quieter. Traditions do not vanish with the ruler who shaped them. They linger in habits, in expectations, in the unspoken rules that survive change. Some customs softened. Others merely changed their language. What once had been enforced by fear was now justified by continuity. This is how it has always been, they were told. The phrase carried the weight of generations. Yet something endured that had never existed before: awareness. Women began to recognize cruelty even when it wore gentler faces. They noticed when silence was encouraged in the name of peace, when endurance was praised instead of questioned, when choice was offered only within invisible boundaries. The lessons learned under Aurelius had sharpened their perception. Not all resisted. Many could not. Survival still demanded caution. But the haunting lost some of its power. Fear, once unquestioned, was now examined. Obedience, once automatic, became deliberate. In quiet moments, women shared stories without disguises. They no longer spoke only in fragments. They named traditions as cruelty rather than fate. They understood that remembering did not erase pain, but forgetting ensured its return. King Aurelius Varron would be remembered in official histories as a disciplined ruler, a guardian of order, a man of tradition. His statues would stand unchallenged. His name would endure in stone. But among the women of his court, his true legacy lived elsewhere, not in monuments, but in knowledge hard-earned. They had learned that the most dangerous traditions are not those imposed by force, but those accepted as normal. That cruelty, when ritualized, becomes invisible. And that silence, when inherited, can haunt long after the source is gone. In the end, what remained was not his power, but their understanding. And understanding, once awakened, could never be fully undone.